Hello, everybody. My name is Samay Gandhi, and my topic today is the impact of COVID-19 on small, full-service, family-owned restaurants in Plymouth, Minnesota. So let's get started. Before we get started, though, there is some important context that we need to establish. So my topic is small businesses, family businesses, and COVID-19. And there are two clear reasons as to why I was drawn into this topic. And I also think that this topic could affect the entire American economy. The first reason that I was drawn in was the very reason that I'm presenting to you over Zoom. But it's COVID-19. See, COVID-19 has damaged and decimated the American economy. And we can see how small businesses in particular have been damaged even more than other businesses, from a top to bottom. First, at the very top, we can see that non-essential businesses were closed or limited in operations, usually mandated by a state government. At the same time, a substantial amount of consumers were told to stay home by their government or chose to do so for public health. As a consequence, a study from the University of Illinois, Harvard University, and the University of Chicago explained that 100,000 small businesses closed within the first few months of COVID-19. At the same time, the American government stepped in, giving the Paycheck Protection Act, the PPP, to 4 million American businesses, hoping to mitigate the damage to the American economy. But this actually didn't help enough. In fact, this database called Track the Recovery shows the immense damage that is occurring to small businesses in the United States. On the top right, we can see a figure that explains that 1 in 3 small businesses in our country have shut down. This is especially worse for specific industries, specifically that of leisure and hospitality. Now, businesses closing down wouldn't be too bad if, let's say, there were only 100 small businesses in our country, but this is not the case. In fact, 99% of all businesses in the United States are small businesses. And at the same time, 90% of those are family owned. This directly leads me into the second reason as to why I was pulled into the topic, but not COVID-19, but rather small businesses. See, they contribute so much to the American economy. We're talking about 63% of the American workforce, almost 80% of all new job creation, and almost 60% of the American GDP. Damage to this area of the American economy is incredibly important and incredibly dangerous, which means understanding why some businesses could survive is just as important. So let's revisit the idea that leisure and hospitality were hit the hardest. For small businesses, one of these areas of leisure and hospitality that was hit extremely hard is food service industry. Specifically within the food service industry, small businesses are classified as restaurants. But the classifications of restaurants are also extremely important. On the right-hand side, we can see the classification of the FSR, or full service restaurant. On the left-hand side, we can see the quick service restaurant, or QSR. Now, the FSR was actually mandated to close and has no drive-through models by the Minnesotan government and by other governments of the United States. At the same time, QSR businesses didn't suffer as much during COVID-19 because the way that their model is built is that they have drive-through areas. So overall, the economic impact of COVID-19 has been much more damaging for full-service restaurants, which are otherwise classified as sit-down restaurants. Now, as I mentioned earlier, family-owned businesses make up 90% of small businesses, but I'll clarify more on why I chose family-owned restaurants a little later in my methodology. In order to research something, we have to choose a geographical location. Coincidentally, the Twin Cities metropolitan area was an extremely beneficial and good area to research for this topic. First, it belongs to one of the strictest responses of COVID-19 out of any state in the United States, that is Minnesota. At the same time, the Twin Cities metropolitan area is a top 10 metropolitan area in terms of small business density. But more importantly, 50% of all leisure and hospitality small businesses in the area have permanently closed or are closed due to COVID-19. But the Twin Cities metropolitan area has over 2 million people. We have to break it down into similarly populated cities. And of these cities, one was randomly chosen, that was Plymouth, which meant that I had to do some driving since I live in Maple Grove. But all of this leads to my overall research question, to which I also created a consequent hypothesis. So let's jump into the research question first. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on small, full-service, family-owned restaurants in Plymouth, Minnesota? In my actual project, we elaborate on the idea of impacts. We're talking about operational impacts or changes in the way that the business is run and sees profit. Now, the goal of this research is not only to test a hypothesis that is made in response to this question and to find impacts of COVID-19, but at the same time, as a consequence of the results, we hope to build a hypothesis as well, since this is an emerging topic. By building a hypothesis from the results of this study, we can continue this research in other areas. Before we get right into my hypothesis, it's important to notice pertinent literature that allowed me to develop my hypothesis. On the left-hand side is a paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research by Bartik et al. If you read the title, you can notice that it's an early service of COVID-19. The conclusions of the study primarily say that most small businesses in the United States have chosen to cut costs by removing employees. That's particularly their response to COVID-19. On the right-hand side, we can see a paper done by the New York Federal Reserve Bank in an analysis of the 2008 to 2009 Great Recession. What they mention is that in the face of financial crisis and lowered financial revenue, businesses chose not to specifically undertake new investment, like building new capital. This led me to directly create my hypothesis as a consequence. I hypothesized a reduction in employees and no new investment is the overall impact of COVID-19 on these full-service restaurants. But in order to test my hypothesis, I have to research it. To study this, I use a method known as a case study. A case study chooses cases that are representative of a phenomenon and allows me to investigate them. But it also allows me to investigate this phenomenon in its real-life context, in which the subjects are unmanipulated by me, the researcher. More importantly, it allows me to explain the impacts and create deeper insight into the issue than other methods perhaps would. But I want to explain exactly how I implemented my case study. So here's a diagram of the exact 3 processes that I used to conduct my study. We'll go more in depth into each section in a little bit. I first started by selecting my cases. I then went into collecting my data through a process known as narrative interviews. Lastly, I analyzed this data through a process known as a paradigmatic mode of analysis. So let's start with case selection. I chose a method known as purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is not random, and it allows me to concentrate on surviving businesses that fit my distinct criteria that are very representative of the phenomenon that I identified previously. These strict parameters have very specific reasoning that allow me to address my question. So in finding my cases, I first went to the Department of Employment and Economic Development of Minnesota, and I found that the NAICS, or North American Industry Classification System, had a classification of 722511 for certain businesses. These are full-service restaurants. I then further classified these businesses through the US SBA's metrics to ensure that the businesses that I was using were similar in size and could be classified as small businesses. Lastly, I ensured that all of these businesses were family-owned. These are not corporate-owned units, so they don't have any corporate backing, but at the same time, choosing family-owned businesses allows me to compare similar models. This left me, through my criteria, with just 8 cases remaining. To analyze and collect data from these cases, I implemented a process known as narrative interviews. This method was outlined by a paper known as narrative interviews from a professor named Jocilovich of the London School of Economics. The narrative interview is essentially a storytelling process where the interviewee describes to me an experience in a chronological and concrete way. And it refers to the experiences of an individual, which allow me to create what is known as a narrative. But the benefits of this is that it allows me to understand the impacts throughout COVID-19. Let's say I were to only implement a survey asking whether or not somebody had certain changes to employment and investment. I would only understand the end results of that survey and of COVID-19. Using narrative interviews allows me to identify and see catalysts and change, rather than just change. But narrative interviews uses a 5-step process. The first is phase 0, but rather than going into every stage, it is important that we understand how they all connect. Phase 0 is essentially research on the context, which is pretty much what we did in the first 10 or so slides of this presentation. It allows me to develop the questions that I want to ask about the potential impacts of COVID-19. Phase 1 and 2 are very focused on the narrative. So in the narrative, I actually ask a different question than my overall research question. That question is, from the beginning of COVID-19 to today, how has the pandemic changed the way you run your business? As you can note, this question is very specific and allows for is very broad. and allows for somebody to create a long story. Phase 3 and 4 then refer to questioning, in which I can only ask questions in the words of the interviewee. I then analyzed this data with a method known as the paradigmatic mode of analysis. Of the methods to analyze a narrative interview, this method allows me to create themes that can be developed from these narratives and allow me to create results that I can use to test my hypothesis. Let's go a little bit into this. So the paradigmatic mode of analysis relies on something known as paradigmatic cognition. We do this every single day. We organize what we hear into common categories. In the same sense, I did this with the interviews. I referenced or re-listened to the interviews and transcribed them, and then I turned them into themes. Instead of telling you how I did this, let's do one together. On the left-hand side, we can see an excerpt of a paragraph of a transcribed interview. What we do is we take the content on the left, which was taken from a broader narrative interview, and we categorize it into a keyword theme on the right, which is in this case, social responsibility. The ability to make conclusions like this was very much so aided by this step. With this method, I was able to make conclusions that I would have otherwise missed. But talking about results points me to the three themes that I found across all businesses, from one or the other. The first is new technology, or investment into online infrastructure. This includes online ordering, websites, and online delivery partners, which certain businesses decided to go further into than before the pandemic. The second is a theme of community support. This is returning customers and positive word-of-mouth promotion, as well as reliance on the local community. Lastly, I found that certain businesses took actions known as social responsibility. Likely the most interesting, these are actions that benefited the community, but actually harmed the business. This includes things like maintaining prices despite an increase in costs of goods sold. What we can see right here is I've coded the results into this table. It is very easy to see which results are pertinent to our study. There are two clear results that we can take away from this. That is new technology and social responsibility, both of which were found in 7 out of the 8 businesses which narrative interviews were conducted on. This leads us directly into our conclusion. But before I get in, let's cover some limitations. There are 4 key limitations to my study. The first is actually described by the author of narrative interviews herself. That is the idea that the process of narration has unrealistic rules. Creating a 10-minute story off the top of your head from one question is very hard. And oftentimes my interviews ended up being a series of questioning and then subsequent narration. At the same time, it is very hard for someone to remember every single detail from an experience. That's why memory error is another limitation. Lastly, there's the issue of sample size. I used just one city because I thought there would be more samples. I used a database from the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and I found businesses under that criteria. But I only ended up with 8. To create a better sample, I could do this for the entire metropolitan area to ensure that these trends that I found are true on a larger scale. So looking back at my initial hypothesis, we can see that I was incorrect about both of my assumptions and estimates. First, I hypothesized that there would be a decrease in employment, but in reality, owners actually committed to maintaining employees. At the same time, I thought that there would be no new investment. But in fact, businesses chose to invest specifically in online infrastructure. This allowed me to create 2 conclusions. Through my method, narrative interviews and paradigmatic analysis, I found that these 2 conclusions were specifically created from the causes and aspects that I was able to understand from the very depth of the method that I chose. I found that owners that show social responsibility are showing collectivist mindsets that are beneficial to society. At the same time, businesses that are undertaking new investment have a greater and accelerated adoption of technology than before, consequently and likely because of low build-out costs in the first place. Now, there are 3 broad implications to my study, and this is probably my favorite part of the study in the first place. The first is government policy, or fiscal policy responses. So what we've seen is that small businesses have a great sense of social responsibility. This means that in the next time we have a financial crisis, the government could choose to invest in them and see a greater return on investment. So I believe that an implication of my study is that future fiscal policies should actually consider investing and assisting small businesses, because we found that they tend to take actions that are beneficial to the broader community, which could help an economic rebound. Beneath this, we can see technology and lower costs, which is a microeconomic example of a decrease in marginal cost of production. Let's break it down. A restaurant has greater orders online and greater transactions online. This means that per unit costs of production will decrease. For example, the restaurant doesn't have to provide a water glass or a server to every individual who sits down. In microeconomics, you would call this a decrease in marginal costs of production. This would consequently lead to a small business having greater revenue, consequently larger economic growth for the American economy, and likely these small businesses will hire more people as well. Lastly, I believe that my study contributes to further research in the field of corporate social responsibility. Research is currently looking at what warrants social responsibility from businesses, and this particularly shows that specific situations like the pandemic over the 2008 recession have led to greater senses of social responsibility. Thus, it creates a new pathway to understand what exactly warrants corporate social responsibility. And so to conclude, we come with my final hypothesis, or a build of a hypothesis, that is, the impact of COVID-19 on small, full-service, family-owned businesses is the accelerated adoption of new technology, specifically online infrastructure, and a greater sense of social responsibility from these businesses. Thank you.
All right, Samay. So for your presentation, you know that it's followed by oral defense questions, and you've had an opportunity to prepare for these oral defense questions, and I'll ask you one from each category: research process, your depth of understanding, and reflection on the inquiry process.
Okay.
My first question for you is, how did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead you to your final research question? You did allude to that, but maybe add on.
Definitely. So initially, I read a lot about financial recessions, and I understood a lot about the 2008 to 2009 recession. But I also noticed from emerging research that the impacts of this recession, a pandemic-induced recession, were very, very new. So not only did I want to compare this pandemic to previous crises by creating a hypothesis and testing this hypothesis, I also wanted to build a new hypothesis. So my goal of this project became twofold: to first test it and then to build a new one to create further research. In this same sense, I created my research question by looking at the fact that this pandemic was largely unexplored, and I based my hypothesis off of previous recessions.
So thinking about that, you've already described a little bit about the ways in which your research could lead to future research in the field, but I'm wondering if you can give a little more information on that. How could we continue the question and understanding it better?
Definitely. So one way that we could continue it, away from social responsibility and toward what I just said, is that I've made this new hypothesis of the idea that there's new technology and a greater sense of corporate social responsibility. What somebody else could do with my new hypothesis is create a large, widespread survey to analyze many businesses in their metropolitan area, small businesses across the country, and see if the trends that I found are very widespread across the country.
All right, and then to kind of wrap this up here, can you tell me a little bit about, if you were able to revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
I think if it came to revisiting it, I would definitely choose a bigger sample. So originally, I didn't think that I would only gain a few cases, but if I took a bigger sample and I repeated the exact same process, I could perhaps find results that are more representative of the entire metropolitan area. And I'd get findings that are more important and could be used in a broader sense than just Plymouth, Minnesota. So from this, I think I really understood the importance of sample sizes, as well as limitations to data, such as only using the city.
All right, well, that wraps up the formal part of your presentation with oral defense. So